They said I was in the way of the wedding photos, so I stepped aside. But when I left, I took the truth with me, frame by frame. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't argue. I just stood there, heart pounding beneath the silk dress I'd picked with so much care, and walked quietly out of the frame. The photographer didn't stop me. No one did. And maybe that's what hurt the most. My name is Marianne Delaney. I'm 71 years old, a retired art teacher, and a photographer for as long as I can remember. I lost my husband, Paul, 15 years ago, and since then, I've poured my heart into two things, my studio and my daughter Isabel. She's everything to me, my only child, my North Star. So when she called one evening to say she had news, I was already smiling before I picked up the phone. "Mom," she said, breathless and bubbling, "we're engaged." I could hear her joy bouncing off the walls, and even through the phone it felt like light breaking into a dark room. Daniel Crestwood was his name. She said it like it sparkled. Handsome, well-spoken, and in her words, so thoughtful it hurts. He worked in finance, had a sailboat, and made her laugh. At least, she said he did. We met for dinner 2 nights later, a cozy Italian place near the harbor, the kind of spot where you can smell garlic in the wood. Isabel wore pale blue, her father's favorite color. Her eyes danced as she showed me the ring. Daniel smiled warmly, too warmly maybe, but I brushed it off. Widows get cynical sometimes. When dessert came, I did what I had dreamed of doing since she was in pigtails. I leaned in, opened my purse, and slid a printed bank statement across the table. "I want to pay for the wedding," I said, voice soft but certain. "It's something I've saved for my whole life." Daniel's smile froze for a blink, just long enough for me to catch it. Then came the gratitude, perfectly timed, as if pulled from a script. "That's incredibly generous, Marianne." I suggested Henry, my dear friend and business partner of over 30 years, to photograph the wedding. He's won awards, taught master classes. He's captured every moment of Isabel's life from behind his lens, first steps, graduations, even her first apartment. "We're thinking of something a little more modern," Isabel said, looking to Daniel before she spoke. That's when I felt the shift. Not a sharp cut, a slow fade. Over the years, I've taught hundreds of students how to study a composition, how to notice what isn't being said in a painting or a photograph. And that night, sitting under candlelight with my daughter and her fiancé, I saw something change. A realignment, a subtle repositioning in her gaze, her posture. Like someone had slightly tilted the frame of a picture, and now everything felt just a little wrong. That night, back home, I stood in the quiet kitchen and picked up one of my favorite photographs, Isabel and I, hiking in Maine on her 30th birthday. She was laughing at something I'd said, eyes wide and clear, her hand reaching for mine without thinking. The woman I'd seen at dinner barely looked at me. She looked at him. And maybe that's when I knew something precious had shifted. Not gone, but slipping. I didn't know then how much further it would go, or how quiet a mother's voice can become in her own daughter's life. But I was starting to see. If this story touches something inside you, maybe something you haven't even said aloud to anyone, you're not alone. Subscribe to Real Her Stories, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to know they're not imagining it. Sometimes the frame lies, but the truth always finds its light. There's a moment as a photographer when you sense the subject is no longer facing the lens, not because they've turned their head, but because something deeper has turned. A subtle shift, an emotional retreat. That's how it felt, watching Isabel become someone I no longer quite recognized. It started quietly, like a background noise you don't notice until it's suddenly unbearable. One afternoon, I dropped by her apartment with swatches for the floral arrangements, lilies, blush roses, Queen Anne's lace, the soft, romantic colors we'd always talked about when she was younger, sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through bridal magazines like they were fairy tales. She smiled politely but told me, Caroline already made a decision with the planner. Caroline, Daniel's mother, a woman who appeared out of nowhere but somehow moved like she'd always belonged. Expensive perfume, tight smile, the kind of presence that fills a room just enough to block the sun. Then came the invitations. They arrived stacked neatly on my dining table while I was out. Not a call, not a question, just there. I opened one and felt my breath catch. Mr. and Mrs. Paul Delaney request the pleasure of your company. My late husband. Gone 15 years. Yet there he was, issuing invitations as if I didn't exist independently. When I asked Isabel about it, her voice was oddly distant. It's just the traditional format, Mom. Daniel says people expect it that way. Daniel says. Caroline says. What did Isabel say? The rehearsal dinner was the final flicker of the girl I raised, or so I thought. My name card sat at the farthest end of the room, practically tucked behind the dessert station. Evelyn, my sister, sat at the head table beside Daniel. Not her niece, Daniel. She looked radiant, like she always did, wearing our grandmother's vintage earrings and chatting animatedly. I'd barely taken my seat when I overheard Daniel leaning toward her. I'd love to get your perspective on long-term yield funds, he said smoothly. Your reputation precedes you. I stiffened. Evelyn managed the trust fund left by our parents. It was considerable. She'd always been protective of it until now, it seemed. When the coordinator asked for toasts, I stood. My hands trembled slightly, but I steadied them. I had rehearsed my words, something short, sweet, a mother's love in 3 paragraphs. But before I could reach the microphone, Daniel stood first. Actually, he said with that unshakable grin, we're going to skip extra speeches tonight. We're already running late. I stopped mid-step. My heels anchored me to the floor as I looked toward Isabel. She avoided my eyes. It was the kind of hurt that doesn't bleed, just settles inside you like wet concrete. I excused myself quietly, found the bathroom down the hall and locked the door. I leaned against the cold sink, staring at my reflection. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Not because I looked older, but because I looked invisible. That's when I heard a knock. Marianne? Henry's voice. I opened the door and tried to smile. I must have caught something, I lied. He didn't push, just handed me a small flash drive. I've been documenting more than just the decor, he said. I frowned. What do you mean? He pulled out his phone and swiped through the photos he'd discreetly taken over the past week. One image showed Daniel in the corner of the venue, speaking to a man I didn't recognize, thin, with graying temples and an expensive watch. The two were leaned in close, Daniel handing something across the table. In another photo, Daniel had his hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder, speaking just as she gestured toward her clutch, the one she always used to carry financial documents. Something feels off, Henry said softly. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. My stomach had already turned. Back at the hotel that night, I learned my room had been moved. No more suite near Isabel, just a small single room beside the ice machine. Apologies, Mrs. Delaney, the clerk said. There was a change requested by Mr. Crestwood. I lay awake listening to the hum of the machine outside, remembering Isabel at age 9, crawling into bed with me after a bad dream. Don't let anyone take me away, okay? She had whispered. I never will, I'd promised. But something was taking her anyway. Over the next few days, the signs multiplied. One bridesmaid pulled me aside and whispered, Isabel's not herself. It's like she has to check with Caroline for everything. At the final dress fitting, I brought the heirloom necklace, a delicate strand of pearls that had belonged to my mother and hers before that. Isabel smiled politely, but declined. Daniel's family gave me this, she said, holding up a heavy diamond pendant. They said all Crestwood brides wear it. It wasn't just a different necklace. It was a different script, a different story. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about flowers or toasts or invitations. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was about erasure. I felt it in every decision I wasn't a part of, in every text that echoed Daniel's voice rather than Isabel's, in every glance that looked through me, not to me. I felt erased, not by accident, but with surgical precision, as if someone were cropping me out of my daughter's life with Photoshop, one click at a time. But I wasn't gone, and I wasn't done. The wedding morning dawned golden, the kind of light photographers dream about. Soft, warm, forgiving, but nothing about that day felt gentle to me. As guests gathered and stylists fluttered around Isabel like birds tending to a bride-shaped nest, I stood just beyond the bridal suite, clutching a small velvet box in my hand. Inside was a pearl hairpin passed down through 5 generations of Delaney women, meant to be worn by Isabel, just as I had worn it, and my mother before me. But when I offered it to Caroline, who barred the doorway with a smile too smooth to be kind, she gently patted my arm. Darling, the bride is resting. Maybe later. Later never came. When the ceremony ended and the photographer began positioning the wedding party for formal photos, I instinctively stepped forward to join them. This was my family, after all. My moment, too. Marianne, Daniel's voice, silky and low, cut through the buzz. Would you mind waiting off to the side for a bit? We're doing just the immediate family right now. I stared at him. "I am immediate family," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm her mother." He smiled, but his eyes didn't. "We'll call you in for your shot." The words weren't cruel. They were worse than cruel. They were efficient. The wedding coordinator touched my elbow gently. "The cocktail hour is just beginning. We'll let you know when it's time." That's when I knew. Whatever had been happening was no longer subtle. I walked out the door, down the stone steps, past the string quartet, and into the parking lot, legs shaking, hands ice cold. But before I left, I found Henry. "They want you gone?" he asked, already knowing. I nodded. "Give me the memory cards." He didn't hesitate. He handed over the small plastic case and whispered, "I got everything, every moment." Back at my home, the studio lights off and the afternoon dimming into shadow, we loaded the files onto my editing station. And what we saw confirmed what I had only suspected before. There was Daniel, quietly pulling Isabel away from her bridesmaids mid-conversation. There was Caroline, her mouth inches from Evelyn's ear, eyes flicking toward her diamond bracelet. The man from the rehearsal dinner, anonymous, forgettable, appeared in frame after frame, always near Daniel, always watching the room. But there was more. The body language, the posture. Isabel's expression, vacant, uncertain, eyes constantly checking Daniel before reacting to anything. It was control disguised as protection, charm used as currency. I sat there in the dark for a long while. Then I picked up the phone. "Deborah," I said when my attorney answered, "I need your help," quietly. 2 days later, we had a name, Daniel Cross, not Crestwood. A known con artist, 3 different aliases, 2 brief marriages ending in quietly settled civil suits, patterns of isolating wealthy women, gaining access to family funds, and disappearing with 7-figure withdrawals. And Caroline? She wasn't his mother. She was his partner, not by blood, by business. They had perfected a playbook: find the mark, win her, cut off the mother, charm the aunt, control the narrative, drain the accounts, vanish. Isabel wasn't just being pulled away from me. She was being rewritten. I knew better than to confront her with accusations. She wouldn't hear them. She was too far inside the illusion. So I did what I've always done. I told the story, with images. I spent the next 2 nights building an album. It began with her childhood, sun-soaked birthdays, camping with Paul, her high school art show where she won 2nd place but beamed like it was gold, her first real camera, our first trip alone after Paul died, laughter in every frame. Then I layered in the more recent shots. Gradually, the wedding preparations, her stiff posture, her strained smile, the constant shadow of Daniel near her elbow, the ones where she looked like a guest at her own wedding. I included a final envelope tucked in the back cover, a USB drive labeled only with her name. Inside were documents, legal records, screenshots, reports from other women, names, bank accounts, a map of betrayal. 3 days later, I met her at her condo. She opened the door looking tired. Her posture was small. Daniel wasn't home. "I just wanted to drop something off," I said, handing her the album. She didn't invite me in. I didn't ask. That night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Isabel. "He told me you were jealous, that you needed to feel important." I stared at the words for a long time before replying. "Maybe, but I never needed you to feel small to do it." I didn't know what would come next, but I knew the frame had begun to shift again. And this time, I was the one adjusting the focus. Truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't shout. It slips in quietly, through numbers that don't add up, bank transfers that lead nowhere, names that appear in court records instead of wedding registries. Isabel did what I had only hoped for. She checked everything: the missing funds, the false credentials, the trail of women left behind with empty accounts and broken trust. She called me late one evening. Her voice was steady for the first time in months. "I'm going to confront him," she said. "The police will be here. I want you there too." I stood behind the one-way mirror as Daniel entered their apartment, all charm and smoothness, until he saw the file on the table. His tone shifted, his face contorted, and then he broke. The officer stepped in. Daniel Cross was no longer a shadow. He was a man in handcuffs. Carolyn was arrested hours later in another state. Evelyn, sharp as ever, handed over everything she had. No hesitation. In the weeks that followed, Isabel came back to herself, slowly, deliberately. She cut her hair short just like she'd worn it in college, reclaimed her accounts, began speaking publicly at women's groups, sharing not shame, but clarity. At one community center event, I watched her stand tall before a room of quiet women. "If someone isolates you from the people who love you," she said, "it's not love, it's strategy." Back on our porch, tea in hand, we watched the sun sink low. I handed her a wrapped box. Inside, a new camera and a folder of partnership papers. "Reynolds and Delaney Photography," I said, "if you're ready." She smiled, eyes bright. "Let's do it." I lifted my camera and focused on her. No veil, no shadow, just strength. "They tried to erase me from the frame," I whispered. "But they forgot. I'm the one holding the lens." Thank you for listening. If you've ever felt sidelined, silenced, or made invisible, your story matters. Like, comment, share, and never let anyone crop you out of your own life.